Family inheritance disputes are one of the leading causes of permanent sibling estrangement in the United States, and I never believed I'd become part of that statistic. My sister looked straight at me during Thanksgiving dinner and said, "Mom and Dad are signing the house to me. You get nothing. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about." That day started like every other Thanksgiving at my parents' quiet suburban home in Ohio, with the smell of turkey in the oven, dishes spread across the table, and everyone pretending we were closer than we really were. I'm Evan Caldwell, the younger one, the dependable one, the son who always shows up early to help and leaves late after cleaning. I honestly thought it would be a calm day, just food, small talk, and getting through another holiday. My sister Marissa arrived late, confident and relaxed, acting like nothing in the world could touch her. Mom kept busy serving food, Dad focused on his plate, and I didn't sense any warning signs. We talked about work, neighbors, and old memories, and I let myself relax for a moment. Then, right in the middle of dinner, Marissa dropped her words like they were nothing, announcing that the house was being signed over to her and that I would get nothing at all. I laughed at first because it sounded too cruel to be true, but no one else laughed. I looked at my parents, waiting for them to explain, deny it, or even soften it, but they stayed silent, their eyes fixed on the table as if it could save them. The silence felt heavier than yelling ever could. My chest tightened as years of quiet effort rushed through my mind. The times I paid for repairs without being asked, the months I covered bills when money was tight, the nights I worried about their health while Marissa lived her life far away. I never helped because I wanted ownership. I helped because they were my parents and I believed fairness existed in families. Around the table, forks scraped plates, forced smiles appeared, and everyone pretended the moment would pass if ignored. I felt exposed, embarrassed, and suddenly very alone, like I was the only one who hadn't known the truth. The house wasn't just walls and memories to me. It was proof of everything I had given without question. Seeing my parents say nothing told me more than words ever could, that my role had always been to give and never expect. That Thanksgiving, surrounded by food and family, I realized betrayal doesn't always come with shouting or anger. Sometimes it comes quietly, in a calm voice, when everyone else expects you to accept it and keep eating. Looking back, I can clearly see the pattern that shaped everything between my sister Marissa and me. From childhood, she was always treated as the golden child, the one who needed protection, second chances, and constant understanding. When she made mistakes, my parents explained them away as stress or bad luck. When I made mistakes, I was told to be responsible, to grow up, and to handle things on my own. I learned early that I was expected to be strong and quiet, while Marissa was allowed to be emotional and demanding. This didn't stop when we became adults. It only became more obvious. Marissa married young, and when that marriage failed, she moved back into my parents' house without questions or conditions. They gave her the old bedroom, helped her emotionally, and supported her financially while she figured things out. No one asked how long she would stay or what she would contribute. At the same time, I had already moved away, built my own life, and focused on my career. I lived in a different city, paid my own rent, and handled my own problems because that was what was always expected of me. Even from a distance, I stayed involved in my parents' lives in quiet ways that were never talked about. When the roof needed repairs, I sent money. When property taxes were due and money was short, I covered them. When medical bills arrived after unexpected visits, I helped without being asked. I didn't announce these things or keep score because I believed family didn't work that way. Meanwhile, Marissa was present in the house, receiving daily support, sympathy, and comfort, yet still seen as the one who needed more. My parents often said I was doing well, that I didn't need help, and that Marissa was going through a hard time. Over the years, that excuse became permanent. I was praised for being independent, but that praise came with silence and distance. Marissa was comforted for struggling, even when her struggles came from choices she made herself. At family gatherings, stories were told about how hard things had been for her, while my efforts were invisible because I never complained. I slowly realized that being reliable meant being overlooked. The more I handled on my own, the less anyone felt the need to consider my feelings. Marissa's return to the house made the imbalance impossible to ignore. She lived there, benefited from the stability I helped maintain, and still held the position of priority. I wasn't angry at first, just confused. I kept thinking fairness would eventually appear on its own. Instead, the gap grew wider. The pattern was clear, but it was never spoken out loud. Marissa was rewarded for needing help, and I was expected to keep giving because I could. By the time Thanksgiving came, this pattern had already decided my place at the table, even if I didn't fully understand it yet. For a long time, no one in my family really knew how much I had paid to keep that house running. I didn't talk about it because I never wanted praise or control. I only wanted things to be fair one day. Over the last 10 years, the expenses added up quietly, almost invisibly, because I handled them from a distance. When the roof started leaking during a heavy storm, my parents were stressed and scared, so I sent the money without hesitation. I remember wiring the payment and telling myself it was temporary help, just what family does. A few years later, when property taxes increased and my parents were short, I covered that too, not once but multiple times, always reminding them not to worry. When the old furnace finally failed in the middle of winter, I paid for the replacement so they wouldn't have to live in the cold. That bill alone was more than most people realize, but I treated it like a responsibility, not a burden. Then there were the medical bills, the emergency visits, the prescriptions that insurance didn't fully cover. Each time, I stepped in quietly because I didn't want my parents to feel ashamed or afraid. I never asked them to write anything down or promise me anything in return. I believed my actions spoke for themselves. What hurt later was realizing that silence works both ways. Because I never spoke about my help, it became easy for everyone to forget it happened. To my sister Marissa, it looked like the house survived on its own, like our parents handled everything themselves. She lived there, benefited from the stability, and never asked how the bills were paid. Over time, I started to understand that money carries meaning, even when no one talks about it. Every payment I made was a piece of my life, hours of work, years of effort, all poured into a home that wasn't mine but felt like it partly was. The house held family memories, but it also held my sacrifices, ones no one acknowledged. I wasn't trying to buy ownership, but I was investing trust. I trusted that when the time came, fairness would naturally be part of the conversation. That belief began to crack when I realized my contributions weren't just ignored, they were erased. No one mentioned them, no one counted them, and no one considered how much I had carried alone. That's when the house stopped being just sentimental to me. It became proof of everything I had done quietly, proof that I hadn't imagined my role in keeping the family afloat. I started to see that my payments weren't just acts of kindness, they were records, evidence of responsibility and commitment. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped helping, and what rights my years of support might actually give me. I didn't want revenge or control, I wanted acknowledgement. The realization settled slowly but firmly. That house wasn't just where we grew up. It was built, maintained, and protected by sacrifices no one wanted to remember, and those sacrifices were mine. I never thought organizing old papers with my dad would change everything, but that day, it did. He asked me to help him sort through stacks of documents in the study, bills, statements, and random notes from years past. I started carefully putting files into folders, thinking it was just another favor. Then, tucked between some old envelopes, I found papers that didn't make sense at first. They were agreements, receipts, and bank records, some going back 10 years. As I flipped through them, I realized they included proof of the money I had sent directly for mortgage payments, roof repairs, furnace replacements, and even property taxes. Every transfer, every contribution I thought had gone quietly unnoticed, was listed in black and white. At first, I felt confused. Why were these records mixed in with the general house paperwork? Then the truth hit me. These documents showed that the house was not as cleanly owned by my parents as Marissa seemed to believe. My contributions had been significant, yet invisible in the eyes of the family. She had acted like the house was completely hers one day, expecting to inherit it without ever acknowledging that I had kept it standing through my efforts. Seeing those records, I felt a mix of betrayal and clarity. The betrayal wasn't just about the announcement at Thanksgiving. It was about years of ignoring what I had done, years of letting Marissa assume she was entitled, while my work went unrecognized. Yet at the same time, clarity replaced my initial shock. Now I understood the full picture. I had proof, undeniable evidence, that my contributions were real and documented. The house was never hers to claim entirely, and the paperwork confirmed it. I realized I had more leverage than I had imagined. I could no longer rely on hope or quiet patience. The papers made it clear that fairness was not just moral, it was factual. I carefully organized them, making sure nothing was out of order, taking mental notes of every receipt and transfer. My father watched quietly as I worked, not commenting, but I could sense the tension in the room. It was as if the truth had been there all along, hidden in the stacks, waiting for me to see it. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and anger. Satisfaction because I now had evidence of everything I had done without asking for recognition. Anger because I realized how easily my efforts had been overlooked and how the family could act as if they didn't exist. For the first time, I felt a sense of control. I knew that this information could change the course of what everyone assumed about the house and my role in supporting it. What Marissa believed about the house, what my parents assumed about fairness, and what everyone expected of me could no longer remain unchallenged. The betrayal had grown deeper over time, but with the paperwork in front of me, I finally had clarity. I understood my value and the truth of my contributions, and I knew that this quiet knowledge could be the start of changing everything. I knew I couldn't ignore what had happened at Thanksgiving, so I waited until later that evening when the house was quiet to talk to my parents privately. I asked them to sit with me in the living room, away from Marissa and all the tension at the table. I wanted to understand why they were giving the house entirely to her, after everything I had done for them over the years. My voice was calm, but inside I felt the weight of frustration and hurt. My parents listened politely, but the answers I got were vague and unsatisfying. They said Marissa needed stability after her failed marriage and that I was stronger and could handle life without needing the house. When I tried to explain the years I had spent helping pay for the roof, property taxes, and medical bills, they didn't argue. They just nodded and said, "It's already decided, Evan. You have to accept it." I felt my heart sink, but also a strange clarity began to grow inside me. The problem wasn't Marissa alone, and it wasn't just the house. It was the way my parents refused to acknowledge my efforts, the way they treated my contributions as if they didn't matter. Their silence was louder than any argument they could have made. I realized that no amount of pleading, reasoning, or explanation would change their minds, and that recognition would not come from them. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I just listened and let their words and their silence settle around me. I felt the first real sense of emotional detachment I had ever experienced. It wasn't bitterness yet, and it wasn't anger that would make me lash out. It was deliberate, careful, like stepping back from a situation I had tried to fix for years, but couldn't control. I could see clearly now that their decision was final, and that their refusal to recognize my role had nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with habit and favoritism. I thought about how easy it had been for them to make excuses for Marissa while expecting me to carry the weight quietly. For years, I had been strong because they assumed I would be. For years, I had helped because it was expected, not because they valued it. Accepting that was painful but necessary. I didn't want to argue with my parents anymore. I didn't want to try to explain again or hope they would see things my way. Instead, I made a conscious choice to detach. I would remain polite and present, but I would no longer invest my emotions in their decisions. I would no longer allow their silence to control my sense of self-worth. That night, as I left the living room and returned to my own thoughts, I felt the weight lift slightly. The betrayal was real, but so was my ability to protect myself. I understood that detachment didn't mean giving up. It meant preserving my clarity, my dignity, and my next steps. I would move forward carefully, quietly, and deliberately because I had finally realized that silence had become a decision. Not theirs, but mine. After the private conversation with my parents, I thought things might settle, but Marissa had other plans. A few days later, she cornered me in the kitchen while I was helping with some chores. She smiled in a way that immediately set me on edge and said, "You're really taking this way too seriously, Evan. It's just the house. You're being dramatic." I froze for a moment, unsure if I should respond or walk away, but she didn't give me the chance. She kept talking, mocking my reaction to Thanksgiving, twisting my concern into something ridiculous. "Come on," she said. "All those years you've been helping out? You were doing it because you wanted to, not because you were entitled. Don't act like you deserve anything." That hit me harder than I expected. She made it sound like my sacrifices, my late nights covering bills, my quiet efforts to keep the house in good shape, were nothing more than favors I had done out of the kindness of my heart. I had never done any of it for recognition, but to hear her imply it was optional, and that I shouldn't expect anything in return, made my stomach turn. Every word she said dripped with entitlement, the kind of arrogance that comes from believing the world owes you everything. I wanted to argue, to list all the things I had done, to make her understand, but for the first time I stopped myself. I listened instead. I watched her carefully, noticing how her confidence was built on assuming I would react emotionally, that I would yell or cry, that I would give her the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. But I didn't. I stayed calm, silent, and observant. In that moment, I realized that fighting loudly would only feed her sense of power. If I reacted the way she expected, I would be giving her control over the situation. That was when I understood that revenge didn't need to be dramatic or noisy. It didn't need to involve yelling, confrontations, or public arguments. It could be quiet, calculated, and precise. I could use the knowledge I had about my contributions, the paperwork, and the truth that no one wanted to acknowledge to take control in a way she wouldn't see coming. Her entitlement had shown me exactly how she thought, and that knowledge became my advantage. I let her continue talking, letting her words reveal her assumptions and weakness, while I felt a sense of calm settle over me. I realized that the most powerful response wasn't confrontation. It was patience, strategy, and the careful application of the truth I already held. From that day on, I stopped arguing with her. I stopped trying to convince her, and instead, I started planning silently. The quiet leverage I had been building over the years, the payments, the proof, the sacrifices, was about to become the tool I would use. Marissa had crossed the line, but in doing so, she had also shown me exactly how to respond. I wouldn't be loud. I wouldn't be emotional. I would be precise, deliberate, and in control. The moment of clarity was mine, and it was the turning point in the quiet battle that had been building between us for years. After the encounter with Marissa, I realized I needed to understand my options clearly. I started by consulting a lawyer who specialized in family and property matters. I wanted to know if all the money I had sent over the years for repairs, taxes, and medical bills gave me any legal claim to the house, or at least the right to reimbursement. Sitting in the lawyer's office, going through bank statements and receipts, I finally saw my contributions not as favors but as evidence. Every payment, every transfer, every emergency I had handled quietly was now part of a clear financial trail. The lawyer explained that while it wasn't simple, the documentation I had kept could be the basis for partial ownership or significant reimbursement. It wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It was about fairness and using the law to balance what had been ignored for too long. Going through my records, I realized something else. Marissa's confidence and entitlement depended entirely on me continuing to support our parents quietly. She assumed I would keep paying bills, fixing things, covering emergencies, and staying in the background while she claimed the house as her own. That assumption was her weakness. I had been the invisible backbone of the household, and she had never acknowledged it. Knowing this changed everything. I decided to stop supporting the household in the way I had been. I wasn't going to abandon my parents or let them suffer, but I was going to be deliberate about how I helped, if at all. I informed them calmly that I would no longer cover certain payments directly, and that I would be documenting any support I provided from now on. My actions were legal, ethical, and measured. I didn't storm out. I didn't create drama. I simply stopped being the invisible safety net. The change was immediate, though subtle. The furnace repair, the property tax payment, the small emergency bills, I either paused them or redirected them through proper channels. It was quiet, but it sent a message. Marissa noticed the difference almost immediately. Where she had assumed everything would continue as before, she now had to confront the reality that I wasn't just quietly giving anymore. The tension in the house grew, though I remained composed. I wasn't seeking conflict. I was asserting boundaries and taking control of a situation I had previously let others define. At the same time, the sense of calm I felt was surprising. For years, I had carried the weight silently, but now, every action I took was intentional. I realized that leverage doesn't have to be loud or aggressive. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, and built over time. By knowing my value and asserting my contributions legally and ethically, I held power in a way Marissa couldn't anticipate. She had assumed my quiet nature meant weakness, but it had always been the opposite. Now, my quiet leverage had become the foundation for fairness. I was in control, not through anger or confrontation, but through preparation, patience, and careful action. The house and our family dynamics had finally shifted, and I had done it calmly, deliberately, and on my own terms. Once I decided to stop quietly covering the house expenses, the change was almost immediate. The roof needed a small repair, and the usual contractor calls went unanswered because no one had sent the payment. The furnace needed maintenance, but the check I used to send never arrived. Even small things like utility bills and property taxes began to pile up. Marissa had always assumed I would handle these quietly, without question, and for years she had relied on my reliability. But now, faced with the reality, she had to step in herself. At first, she acted confident, insisting she could manage everything, that it was no big deal. But reality hit quickly. She didn't know which bills were due first, how to coordinate the repairs, or even which contractors to call. Payments were late, appointments missed, and small mistakes began to stack. Every day, I could see the frustration on her face, the impatience growing as she tried to fix problems she had never noticed before. My parents, who had also assumed I would keep handling things, began to feel the effects too. Calls for repairs went unanswered, bills were overdue, and small tensions turned into arguments between Marissa and them. For years, they had depended on me quietly, never acknowledging how much I had done to keep everything running smoothly. Now, suddenly, the absence of my support made it impossible to ignore. I watched from a distance, calmly, as the household that had seemed so stable began to wobble. I wasn't interfering. I was simply letting the consequences show themselves. Marissa's frustration turned into panic as she realized that keeping the house in order was harder than she had ever imagined. Every mistake reminded her that I had been carrying the weight without complaint, that my quiet efforts had been the backbone of the household. My parents began to speak, finally, acknowledging my contributions in small ways, almost reluctantly. Evan always handled this, they admitted, their voices low, a mix of shame and surprise. We didn't realize how much he did. Hearing it was strange, a mix of satisfaction and sadness, because it was too late for the easy gratitude I had once expected. I didn't gloat, I didn't make threats. I simply observed, letting the tension speak for itself. Marissa, usually confident and assertive, now struggled to maintain control, and my parents had to confront their own assumptions about fairness and responsibility. For the first time, the invisible work I had done for years was visible, and it made a difference in a way I had hoped it would. It wasn't about revenge, it was about reality replacing assumptions. The house, the bills, the repairs, all the things I had quietly handled, suddenly revealed what had been taken for granted. I felt a quiet sense of relief and validation. The balance had shifted, not through anger or confrontation, but through patience and action. Marissa had to face the consequences of assuming I would always be there, and my parents had to recognize the full scope of my contributions. For the first time, everyone could see clearly what had kept the family home standing, and it wasn't just luck or care. It had been me all along. A few weeks after I stopped quietly covering the house expenses, another family gathering took place. This time it was smaller and quieter, the kind of dinner where everyone felt tension in the air. Marissa tried her usual confident attitude, smiling as if everything was normal, but I could see the uncertainty behind her eyes. Mom and Dad sat stiffly, not saying much, probably realizing that things had already started to shift. I had spent the past days organizing all the records of my contributions. The roof repairs, the property taxes, the furnace replacement, the emergency medical bills, all carefully documented with bank statements, receipts, and notes. I wasn't there to yell or accuse anyone. I didn't want drama. I simply wanted fairness. After the first course, I placed the folder in front of them on the table and calmly began explaining what it contained. I went step by step, showing the money I had sent, the bills I had covered, and the repairs I had arranged. I kept my voice even, my expression calm, and my words precise. There were no accusations, no anger, only facts. I told them clearly that my contributions were significant and ongoing, and that my role had been ignored for years. I explained that I expected either fair compensation for my efforts or legal recognition of my involvement in the property. I made it clear that I was serious, but I didn't threaten anyone. I simply stated the truth. For a moment, the room went completely silent. Marissa shifted in her seat, glancing at my parents and then at me. I could see the panic begin to show. Her confident mask was cracking. She had assumed I would stay quiet, that I would continue helping without complaint, and that her entitlement would go unchallenged. But now, faced with clear evidence, she couldn't hide her anxiety. Mom and Dad exchanged glances, their silence heavier than anything they had said before. I watched as they realized how much they had relied on me without acknowledging it. Their favoritism, their assumptions about Marissa being more in need and me being stronger, suddenly became impossible to ignore. I didn't interrupt or argue. I simply waited as the weight of the evidence sank in. The power in the room had shifted quietly, but completely. I wasn't demanding revenge. I wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. But the truth had given me authority in a way I had never had before. Marissa's panic grew, and she fumbled through words, trying to explain herself, but the facts were undeniable. Mom and Dad were forced to confront their past choices, to see clearly how their actions had affected both of us. That dinner ended with no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, just a calm, firm understanding that things had changed. For the first time, I felt the balance of power had moved in my favor, not through anger or shouting, but through patience, preparation, and the careful presentation of the truth. The family could no longer ignore my role or my sacrifices, and everyone at that table had to see me as more than the quiet helper I had always been. That night, fairness became visible, and the power dynamic inside our family had shifted forever. After the dinner where I calmly presented all the evidence, the situation began to move toward a resolution. I had already decided that I wasn't going to let emotion guide me anymore. I knew exactly what I wanted: recognition of my contributions and fairness in the outcome. I spoke with my lawyer and laid out all the options clearly. I could negotiate for my rightful financial share, or, if necessary, force the sale of the house to settle the matter. I didn't rush. I didn't make threats. I simply made it clear that fairness would be achieved one way or another. Marissa, who had always assumed she would inherit everything without question, started to realize her position was no longer secure. The confidence she had shown for so many years began to falter as she faced the reality that the house wasn't hers to claim entirely. Her sense of entitlement began to crumble, and she couldn't rely on my parents to protect her this time. Mom and Dad, for the first time, were forced to acknowledge the full scope of my contributions. They could no longer pretend that everything had been handled magically or that Marissa deserved special treatment over me. Their silence had ended, replaced with cautious conversations and attempts to find a solution. I stayed calm throughout, never raising my voice, never seeking revenge in a dramatic way. I wasn't interested in humiliating anyone. I wanted fairness, and I wanted to walk away knowing that the situation was resolved on my terms. Negotiations were slow, but the truth was undeniable. The financial trail I had documented, the receipts, bank statements, and records of repairs and bills, gave me a strong position. Eventually, we reached an agreement that acknowledged my contributions and secured my share. Whether that meant a payout from the family or part of the house itself, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the recognition and fairness I had long waited for were finally achieved. Walking away, I felt more than just the satisfaction of money or justice. I felt clarity about my boundaries and the strength to protect them. I understood the value of my work and sacrifices, and I knew that I would never allow myself to be overlooked or taken for granted again. Marissa had to face reality, and she could no longer assume that her desires automatically outweighed my rights. My parents had lost control of the story they had been telling for years, the one where Marissa was always favored, and I was always quiet and giving. That control shifted to me, not through anger or confrontation, but through patience, preparation, and careful action. The revenge, if it could be called that, was quiet, realistic, and permanent. It didn't involve shouting, blaming, or tearing anyone down. It involved asserting truth, setting boundaries, and securing fairness. Walking away from that situation, I carried more than money. I carried self-respect, understanding of my value, and confidence that I could protect myself and my future. The house, the family, and the past had all changed, but I had changed too. I left with the knowledge that I had acted with integrity, that I had defended what was rightfully mine, and that my quiet strength had finally been recognized. In the end, I had more than a house. I had peace, clarity, and control over my life. Family inheritance disputes can quietly damage relationships if left unaddressed, but understanding your rights and documenting contributions can protect both your finances and self-respect. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to support our channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing it with those who value fairness and family clarity.